Hello and welcome to the Moms Who Know podcast. I'm your host, Chanel Nielsen. And today we are joined by a great guest, Alissa Parker. Alissa, how are you today? First of all, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you.
Good. Well, welcome to Moms Who Know. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Let me tell you a little bit about Alissa. So Alissa grew up in Ogden, Utah, the youngest of 5 children. She graduated from Weber State University and during her university days married her high school sweetheart, Alissa Parker. They are the proud parents of 3 beautiful girls, Emily, who passed away at age 6 in the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, Madeline, do you say Madeline or Madeline?
It's Madeline, yep.
Madeline, okay. And Samantha. And after her daughter Emily was killed, Alissa co-founded 2 nonprofit organizations, Safe and Sound Schools, which empowers parents and educators about school safety, and the Emily Parker Art Connection, and that helps fund and support art programs for children. So, Alissa, we are so glad to have you and to learn from some of your experiences. Let's go ahead and start. If you could tell us just a little bit about your story, and we all are probably familiar from the news with the events of that day of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. I'm sure as moms, that was something I know for me that really stood out. But can you tell us a little bit about that day?
Absolutely. It was much like any other day in Connecticut. It was in December. I remember it was just this sunny, cold morning, and I sent my girls off to school. The youngest one was still with me, and it was the last day before school was supposed to be done. And so I remember I needed to go do some last-minute school shopping, and so I was shopping with my youngest daughter, and I received this phone call from the school, and it was a automated message that said that there had been a shooting at one of the schools in Newtown. And I didn't know at the time, what school they were talking about specifically. Automatically, I thought, it must be the high school. And I remember getting in my car and starting to drive towards the school, and I passed the high school, and there was nothing going on there, and my heart just dropped, and I found out that it was at the elementary school. And when I got there, it was just utter chaos, and that was something that was completely unfamiliar to me. I'd never been involved in something like that, and this was a small town, small community, and I remember being really caught off guard by the chaos around the school, and what most people don't understand about where the school is located. The driveway to the school is quite long, and it's tucked away, and the firehouse, the Sandy Hook Firehouse Department, is on that corner where you turn into the driveway, and so that's where all of the reunification happened. And so I went there in search of Emily, my daughter, and I was ushered into a room with all the other parents, and that was where I waited for 5+ hours to be told that I wouldn't be bringing her home that day. And it was just indescribable, the shock, the horror of the entire thing, and then the realization that she was gone was just impossible to even imagine.
Wow. So 5 hours of waiting in that room. Were the other parents there? Was Robbie there with you? What was kind of going on? Was there a lot of speculation, or at some point did you kind of realize what the news was going to be?
I think all of those emotions kind of happened within that 5-hour time frame. What had happened was Robbie worked at the hospital, and he was at work that day, and whenever a shooting or some kind of emergency in the community happens, they put the hospital in lockdown. So Robbie, my husband, was in lockdown for the first few hours at the hospital. but we were told that some of the kids might be going to the hospital if they were injured. And so I wanted him at the hospital because he was there to tell me if our daughter was there and if she was okay. And so I really wanted him to stay as long as possible to get information that I wasn't privy to where I was at. And at the firehouse, they really didn't tell us a lot of information. It was just a little bit at a time because they didn't have a lot of answers and they didn't want to tell us something that they would have to take back. And they were very careful what information they gave us. And so it was very frustrating. I remember just being mostly frustrated with the lack of information. Even though I understand now why they didn't, it was incredibly difficult to sit there and not understand and know the full extent of what was happening. And so Robbie was able to come to the hospital, or come from the hospital eventually. We talked to him, and the hospital told him basically, you need to go and be with your wife. And so he said that when they told him that, he knew that she was dead, but he didn't say anything to me. And by the time he got to the firehouse, he said, he said nothing about what he was feeling or thought. And right before he came into the firehouse, we were told that 20 kids were dead, but we didn't know if it was our kids or not at that point. And so it was obviously really startling to hear information like that.
Yeah. So in the firehouse, were all the parents from the school there, or just the parents from Emily's class? How did they divide it up?
So it was all of the families of missing children. And,
okay.
And
so they
also
let the
families.
Kids...
and the families of the adults as well that were
okay.
there.
So they had let the kids come, the kids that were okay, they let them go with their parents. So it was just those of you that were waiting
Right.
for the news.
So in the main firehouse area was kind of where all the reunification was happening. So parents were getting their kids and leaving.
Okay.
And then if you didn't have your children, they had you go to the back in this conference room at the back of the firehouse. And it was in this conference room where the parents congregated that were still waiting for their missing children. And I really thought that it was going to be a place that was full of action, where you'd have kids come in, you'd see them unify, and more parents would come in, and then more kids would come in. And that was not what happened. It was just a lot of parents filling in, and then we just waited, and no one left.
Okay, so of course this is every parent's worst nightmare, and you're so brave to talk about it and to share it publicly. I mean, of course it was a very public thing, and in some ways you can't, hide from it, but I just think you're so brave to go out there and then to do what you've done from this terrible experience and to turn it into what you've turned it into. So one of the things that I have been so impressed with you and your husband is your guys' ability to forgive and kind of move forward from it. In 2012, I spoke to a group about forgiveness, and I actually spoke about you guys, and I'm going to read here some of those things that I said.
Okay.
Okay, so Robbie Parker is the father of 6-year-old Emily Parker, who was a victim in the recent tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut. In an interview, he expressed condolences to all of the families who lost loved ones, including the shooter's family. Let it not turn into something that defines us, but something that inspires us to be better, to be more compassionate and more humble people. Let us please keep the sentiments of love that we feel for our families and the compassion that we feel for others, even complete strangers, at all times, not just in times of sorrow or tragedy. Now, that was within days of the shooting that he said that.
Right.
And then this is from an interview with Katie Couric. She said, "You said that you have no anger toward the young man who did this." "I really don't," he said. "From what we learned is that he was someone who was struggling with something that was very, very dark, and something that he was struggling with mightily. And he struggles with something that was very different from the struggles I have in my life. And so I can't have any judgment towards him for those things that he might have been fighting. Katie Couric then said, "How about you, Alissa? How are you feeling about the young man who did this?" And you said this, "You know, as hard as it is to deal with the loss of my daughter, I feel very blessed by my Heavenly Father that that's not something I've had to even struggle with at all. Because I feel like it would overwhelm me if I was feeling hatred for him or anger. All I felt was sadness, really, and still to this day, all I felt is sad. I felt bad for him because I can't imagine the state of mind that someone is in to do something like that. That's such a dark and evil and awful place to be, and if anyone's in a position like that, I can't even imagine how hard that would be, and I feel so sad that that's where he was. I really, truly feel that way." So that just touched my heart so much when I heard you say that. How were you able to feel like that so soon after, and how have those feelings changed as the grief process has gone on?
Wow, it's been a long time since I've heard those words. So it kind of made me reflect a little bit more as you were saying that, as far as, where I am now and how I've gotten to where I am. I remember right after the shooting happened, we were all sitting in a room talking, my husband and I and some of our relatives, and he was preparing to do this press release because so many people were coming to family and friends and asking them to comment on Emily, and he felt very strongly that if anyone said anything about his daughter, it would be from us. And so he was planning to do what we thought was a little press conference that ended up being broadcast to a much wider audience than we had anticipated, which we were not planning. But I remember when we were talking about it, he said something about the families. And the only thing I kept thinking was, I can't imagine what they're feeling right now. And that was the truth. Like, I couldn't imagine knowing someone that you love and you care about was capable of doing something so horrendous. And truth be told, I can't even imagine someone knowing that someone could do this and allowing it to happen. So that was never even in my mind that this family, had done anything on purpose or had done anything knowing they could have done something different, in that sense, in that mind frame that they were in, how they had no idea. And so I never was angry with them, and I never felt like pointing a finger at them. I did want to learn from them and understand what could have been done to maybe prevent something like this from happening, but I never felt angry towards them. But in the beginning, I was really numb. I just didn't feel, I felt sad, but I didn't feel anger. I think the anger came later, as I kind of processed what had happened and I got over the initial shock. That anger was still there, and the process of learning to forgive someone like that, it wasn't a quick and easy thing. It took a long time, and honestly, I wasn't really trying. I wasn't really working at it for a long time. It sort of happened very organically, and I'm a person of faith, and that process really surprised me. That how it began was from this sweet conversation with my daughter and my husband, my daughter Madeline, where she talked about how she felt God would see the shooter. And she described him as a person who God loved, but was really disappointed in his choices. And those words really struck me. I didn't really want to consider how God viewed him. I didn't want to consider seeing it from a different vantage point. I was angry, and I felt comfortable that way. I felt like I wanted to hold on to that anger in order to be able to feel that pain so that I could maybe empathize with what Emily went through. Like, getting rid of it almost felt like I was letting go of something that connected me to her that day. I know that sounds probably bizarre, but I didn't want to let myself off the hook.
Right.
And I wanted to hold on to that. And that was the first time that I looked at it differently. And the second I did that, I felt a change in my heart. And we ended up speaking with the shooter's father, and that was due to that conversation we had with Madeline, that really chain of events that led towards this conversation with him. And in that conversation, I learned more about him, and it humanized him for me. It changed my viewpoint again. And so all these things weren't things I was actively looking for, but I think that that's oftentimes the way God works in all of us, is that he knows we can't handle things all at once. And so he throws us out these sweet, tender mercies that help change our heart gradually. And that was my case. And it's interesting because forgiveness for me was not a one and done thing. You know, when I finally felt like I had forgiveness in my heart, it was less about the statement, "I forgive you," and more about the state of emotions and feelings I was having, where I was at peace with it. But those feelings return. They return when it's Christmas. They return when it's Halloween. They return all the time when there's a moment where I know my daughter's missing, and I'm angry, and I feel resentful, or I feel frustrated, and I have to choose to forgive again. I have to make that choice to allow that feeling of peace to come back, and to feel those feelings of forgiveness. So it's very complicated, and it's something I still to this day have to do, but I get better at it, and I'm stronger, and it gets easier.
Oh, there's so much wisdom in what you just shared with us. And listeners, I encourage you to go back and re-listen to that, because there are so many truths in there that we can take away. I love that you talked about forgiveness as a process, and it's kind of like, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You mentioned that, you work on it, and yet there are layers and layers, and especially with something that's so big and so life-changing. And sometimes when we have something to forgive, and I've never dealt with anything, on this spectrum, but when there is something to forgive, sometimes we beat ourselves up like, why can't I just forgive? Why can't I let it go? Instead of recognizing, like you mentioned, that organic process that we let go of a little bit at a time, and we forgive a little bit at a time. And I like also that you mentioned that God meets us there where we're ready. So we show that we're ready, and he helps us through that layer, and then we keep on going. So thank you for that. I think there's just so much to learn in that process that you've gone through. So one of the things that I also admire about you is that you have turned this experience into, looked at it as, how can I help other parents? And one of the ways that you've done that is in your work with school safety. So can you talk a little bit about what you've done and your program, and just go ahead and tell us about Safe and Sound Schools?
Absolutely. So after the shooting, you have to understand, I was very new to the community, and I didn't know anyone. The only person that I had a phone number for was another mom. Her name was Michelle Gay, and it was an RSVP on a birthday invitation for her daughter that was to be the next day after the shooting. And her daughter was in Emily's class. She was a sweet little girl that Emily loved. And when I found out her daughter had also died that day, I called her because I desperately wanted to talk to someone else that knew exactly how I was feeling. And Michelle and I hit it off immediately, and we just connected, and we looked at the world very similarly. But the thing we also had in common was how we processed that day. And neither of us could get out of our minds what went wrong, what could have been prevented, what we could learn from this experience to share with others, to let our hindsight be their foresight into their schools and their communities and how they plan for emergencies. And we wanted to be able to share that. There was this protective motherly instinct that just came over us where we wanted to help protect these children from being an easy target for someone who wanted to do harm. And so that was really where it all began. We just started these conversations, and it really didn't feel like a choice to us. We felt like it was something we had to do. And we wanted to be able to take all the excuses that we heard over and over again as to why communities weren't putting this as a priority, and what obstacles they were having, and take those and challenge them and say, we're going to give you all the resources, all of the material that you need to just get started. No matter how much money you have, no matter what you have as far as resources are concerned, we're going to take all those excuses and eliminate the variables. And we created these programs, online programs and tools, and what we call is a toolkit for these communities to just get started and start to look at school safety very differently. And since that time, we've expanded into other programs and resources, but all of them are free online that we do, and we just really want to encourage and inspire people to see that there's so much they can do. They just have to get started. And that was so really great. The beginning of it.
So if parents are interested in, after hearing this, like, okay, I want to be proactive, I want to make sure that my child's school is a safe place, what do you recommend that they do?
Well, if they want to get started and they just don't know how, if they just go to our website, safeandsoundschools.org, on that website, if you go to resources, there are toolkits that you can download. And that, if you're from the parent community, there are printouts that you can just print out to just get started. So, for example, one of them is a list of things to just print out and look at your school. And you print that out, take it to your school, make observations, see what things that you can see. And then we encourage parents to take that information and those concerns to their school, and not in a combative way, but in a collaborative way. I'm seeing these things. What can I do to help? Mm-hmm. What can I do to see that these changes can be implemented? And then we give many suggestions for how to get an assessment done on your school, how to act upon that assessment, and then what do you do to audit yourself? How do you continue the cycle of making sure you're on top of everything that your school needs? And so we've created this program that allows you to evaluate your school at all different stages and phases of your school safety spectrum. And so we really have all the bases covered as far as starting the conversation and how to start the conversation. And so we really encourage them to print it out, go to your school, see what you can do.
That's such an easy next action for us to take. So safeandsoundschools.org, and go there and take that next step, print it out and see what needs to happen at your school. I love that. We are about out of time, but I definitely want people to know about your new book. So Alissa recently wrote a book called An Unseen Angel that talks about a little bit of what she's talked about today. Tell us a little bit more about why you wrote this book.
Well, I think for me personally, there was so much attention and stories told about the tragedy of that day, but there wasn't much mentioned about the aftermath and the recovery and how families were able to get through this and what helped them. And I really felt like there was so much more to this story that people didn't understand. And the parts that we experienced, as tragic as it was, there were so many beautiful things we discovered and felt and learned as a family that made us stronger and more appreciative, and experiences even with our daughter and kind of understanding the unseen angels in the world, our modern world today. And I don't think those things are often talked about, or at least not talked about enough. And I wanted people to understand that there was a whole other side of the story that wasn't talked about and what that looked like.
Awesome. Well, I know you can get your book on Amazon. Is there any other place you'd like to send our listeners to get your book, or is Amazon the best place?
Yeah, Amazon's the best place. And if they wanted to look at more information about the book, and unseenangel.com has all the information about the story, where you can purchase it, and excerpts from the book if they're interested in learning a little bit more about it.
Perfect. Well, I think that sounds like a great book club selection. I think that I've learned so much from you, from the day of the tragedy until now. And I have been really touched by the things that you've shared with us today. I appreciate it so much. Thank you all for being here on Moms Who Know, and we'll see you next time.